Imagine your mother-in-law has called you a freeloader for years. Then one night, she screams in your face, "You are a parasite in this family," having no idea that at that very moment she is standing in the house that you secretly bought to save her from bankruptcy. Before we begin this incredible story about secrets, forgiveness, and the true meaning of family, please take a moment to write what city you're from in the comments below. We love knowing who's watching. My name is Angela, and I am 55 years old. In the heart of Savannah, Georgia, on a street lined with ancient oaks dripping Spanish moss like gray, wispy beards, stood their family home. It wasn't a mansion, but a proud two-story house with a wide, welcoming porch, a home that had belonged to my husband Walter's family for 3 generations. It was a symbol of their heritage, a fortress of memory and tradition. And this fortress was the kingdom of my mother-in-law, Mama Rose. At 78, she ruled it with an iron will and a tongue so sharp it could cut glass, a tongue that was most often aimed directly at me. For the past 5 years, ever since I'd been laid off from my office administration job, I had been cast in the role of the family freeloader. While Walter worked his steady but modest job for the city, a job he loved but which barely kept us afloat, my contribution was seen as negligible. I managed the household, cooked the meals, tended the garden, and most importantly, I endured. I endured the daily critiques, the subtle and not so subtle barbs from my mother-in-law. "Walter works himself to the bone," she would say at the dinner table, her voice dripping with a martyr's sigh. "And what is your contribution, Angela? What do you bring to this family besides another mouth to feed? You are draining our resources." Walter, a good man caught between the 2 most important women in his life, would just stare at his plate, his silence a form of weary surrender. And I never talked back. I never defended myself. I just absorbed the blows, a quiet shock absorber for the family's anxieties. It was easier than fighting, or so I told myself. I never mentioned the nights after they were all asleep, when the house was dark and quiet. I never spoke of the hours I spent in my small corner of the living room, the glow of my laptop screen illuminating my face, the soft click of the keys, a secret rhythm in the sleeping house. For them, I was the unemployed wife, the parasite. For my clients, I was a highly sought-after freelance financial consultant. For 4 years, I had been quietly, diligently, building a business from nothing. My clients were small business owners, artists, and entrepreneurs from Atlanta to Charleston. I helped them balance their books, secure loans, and plan for their futures. I was good at it. My quiet, steady work brought in an income that often doubled my husband's salary, a fact I kept entirely to myself. It was my secret, my safety net, my private world where I was not a burden, but a respected professional. Keeping it hidden had started as a necessity. I didn't want to emasculate my husband or give my mother-in-law more ammunition to criticize how I spent her son's money. But over time, it had become a quiet, satisfying source of my own power. They didn't know about my job, but there was something else, something much bigger they didn't know. They didn't know that 6 months ago, their precious ancestral home, the very symbol of their legacy, had nearly vanished. Years of mounting debts, a second mortgage taken out in the 90s, and a disastrous reverse mortgage that Mama Rose had signed without fully understanding had culminated in a foreclosure notice. The house was to be sold at a public auction. I had never seen Mama Rose so utterly broken. The queen had lost her kingdom, and it was a grief so profound it silenced even her sharp tongue. And then a miracle happened. Just days before the auction, an anonymous benefactor through a private LLC had purchased the home outright, settling all the debts. The new owner, their lawyer explained, was happy to allow Mama Rose and Walter to remain in the house for a small, symbolic monthly rent, just enough to cover the property taxes. Mama Rose had wept with gratitude, praising the kindness of this mysterious stranger, this angel who had saved their heritage. Tonight, however, her gratitude had clearly run out, and her favorite target was back in her sights. We were finishing dinner when she started in again. "Another one of your bland casseroles, Angela? Is this all you do all day? Walter deserves a real meal when he comes home from a hard day's work." "It's delicious, Mama," Walter said, his voice tired. "I'm not talking to you, son," she snapped. "I'm talking to the leech you married. You're just a parasite in this family." That was it. That was the word that finally broke through my wall of patient endurance. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I calmly placed my napkin on the table, stood up, and walked to the old oak filing cabinet in the corner of the dining room. My heart was pounding, but my hands were steady. I pulled out a thick, heavy folder, walked back to the table, and placed it down with a soft, definitive thud. The time for secrets was over. The silence that followed Mama Rose's pronouncement of me as a parasite was thick and familiar. It was the same silence that followed all her verbal assaults, a space in which my husband, Walter, would retreat into himself, and I was expected to simply absorb the poison. Walter dutifully began clearing the table, his movements stiff, his face a mask of weary resignation. Mama Rose, satisfied with her final wounding pronouncement of the evening, declared she was going to watch her favorite television program. The performance was over, and I, the unpaid and unappreciated supporting actress, was left to clean the stage. As I stood at the kitchen sink, the warm water running over my hands, I didn't feel anger. The sharp sting of her words had long ago faded into a dull, chronic ache. What I felt instead was a profound and surreal sense of irony. Here I was, scrubbing the remnants of a meal I had cooked, in a house I was propping up, being called a drain on the very resources I was secretly replenishing. The sheer, breathtaking absurdity of my situation was a private, bitter comedy that only I was privy to. An hour later, the house was quiet. The gentle, rhythmic sound of my husband's and mother-in-law's breathing drifted from their respective bedrooms. The house was finally asleep. And my real workday was just beginning. I walked into the living room, the space that served as the heart of our family life by day. By night, my small corner of it, the one with the comfortable armchair and the sturdy side table, transformed into my sanctuary, my headquarters, my escape. I pulled my sleek, lightweight laptop from its hiding place in the magazine rack and set it on the table. The act was a quiet ritual. As the screen blinked to life, casting a cool blue glow on my face, I felt a familiar transformation take place. The weary, put-upon daughter-in-law, the woman who absorbed insults and scrubbed pots, receded. In her place emerged Angela Hayes, financial consultant, a sharp, respected professional with a client list that spanned 3 states. Tonight, my first appointment was a video call with a new client, a brilliant young Black woman in Charleston who had started a Gullah Geechee-inspired catering company. Her name was Serena, and her passion was as evident as her talent, but the financial side of her business was a tangled mess. For the next hour, I was no longer a parasite. I was a lifeline. "Okay, Serena, I've reviewed the profit and loss statements you sent over," I began, my voice clear and confident, a stark contrast to the quiet, deferential tones I used with my family. Your food cost percentage is excellent, and your revenue growth is impressive. But the banks are balking at your expansion loan because your cash flow is inconsistent. You're pouring all your profits back into inventory before you've properly allocated for taxes and overhead. On the screen, Serena nodded, her face a picture of rapt, grateful attention. I know, she said, her voice full of frustration. It feels like I'm constantly busy but always broke. That's because you're running a business, not a hustle, I said with a smile. It's time to start thinking like a CEO. We're going to restructure your debt, create a 6-month operating budget, and build a new proposal for the bank that highlights your incredible growth potential, not your temporary cash flow issues. You have $1 million brand, Serena. My job is to make sure your finances look like it. The respect in her eyes, the way she hung on my every word, was a potent antidote to Mama Rose's daily dose of contempt. This was my world. A world where my mind, my experience, and my skills were valued. A world where I wasn't a burden, but a builder. The secret of my work had started as a form of protection, a shield for my husband's pride. When I was first laid off, Walter had insisted he could take care of us. He came from a traditional mindset, and the idea of his wife out-earning him was a delicate matter. So when I started freelancing and my income quickly and quietly began to surpass his, it was simply easier not to mention it. But over the years, the secret had morphed into something else entirely. It had become my own private garden, a space where I could cultivate my own sense of self-worth, a place that was untouched and untainted by my mother-in-law's constant, withering criticism. It was the one part of my life that was completely and totally mine. After my call with Serena, I spent another 2 hours working on a portfolio for a client in Atlanta before finally closing my laptop. I stood up and stretched, the quiet of the house a comforting blanket around me. My gaze fell upon the mantelpiece at the silver frame photos of my family. Walter, smiling on our wedding day. Mama Rose, looking proud and formidable at his graduation. Their heritage, their legacy, the house. It was the center of their universe. The irony, the secret that I now carried like a heavy, leaden weight in my soul, was that my secret world was the only thing keeping theirs from collapsing. My parasitic existence was the only thing holding up the foundation of their precious family home. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that the tide of their own financial irresponsibility was coming in faster than they could ever imagine. My husband's family legacy, the very house in which I was deemed a parasite, was built on a foundation of pride and willful ignorance. They celebrated their history, the 3 generations of Hardgroves who had lived within these walls, but they never bothered to check the soundness of the financial bedrock beneath their feet. I, the quiet accountant in the corner, had seen the cracks forming for years. I saw the unopened bills that would pile up on the credenza, the casual way Mama Rose would spend money she didn't have, the blind faith they all possessed that things would simply, somehow work out. It had all come to a head 6 months ago, on a Tuesday morning that had started like any other, but ended with the foundation of their world crumbling to dust. The morning had been deceptively peaceful. I was in the kitchen, humming along to the radio as I prepared a batch of biscuits, the familiar scent of baking filling the house. Walter was getting ready for work, and Mama Rose was in her beloved garden tending to her prize-winning azaleas. It was a perfect portrait of domestic tranquility, a fragile illusion that was about to be shattered. The mail arrived with its usual soft thud through the slot in the front door. I retrieved the small pile of letters and began sorting through them on the kitchen island. Junk mail, a bill, a postcard from a friend, and then I saw it. A thick, cream-colored envelope with a menacing red-bordered window. It was from a legal firm I didn't recognize and was addressed with a cold formality to Rose Hardgrove, current resident. Mama Rose came inside a few minutes later, her cheeks flushed from the sun, a smudge of dirt on her nose. "Anything interesting?" she asked, reaching for a biscuit. "Just this," I said, handing her the ominous-looking envelope. "It looks important." She took it, her brow furrowing. I watched as she tore it open with her thumb. Her initial expression was one of simple confusion as she scanned the dense legalistic text. She read it once, then again, and the confusion slowly curdled into a dawning, sickening fear. Her hands, usually so steady and capable in her garden, began to tremble. All the color drained from her face. "Angela," she said, her voice a reedy, unfamiliar whisper. I don't understand these words. What is this?" She handed the letter to me, her sharp, critical eyes for once looking at me, not with judgment, but with a desperate plea for clarity. In that moment, I was not the parasite. I was the only person in the house she knew could decipher the language of their doom. I took the letter. The words were blunt, merciless, and final. It was a formal notice of default, an intent to foreclose from a company called Patriot Equities, the current holder of her reverse mortgage. I felt Walter come up behind me, looking over my shoulder. "What is it, Angie?" he asked, his voice tight with an anxiety that mirrored my own. My financial consultant's mind processed the information with a swift, terrible efficiency. I could see the whole tragic story laid out in the cold, hard paragraphs. Years ago, after Walter's father had passed, Mama Rose, seeking to supplement her small fixed income, had taken out a reverse mortgage on the house. It was a financial product often sold to the elderly, a way to access the equity in their home. But she, like so many others, had clearly not understood the fine print. The loan becomes due and payable in full if the homeowner fails to keep up with property taxes and homeowner's insurance. And I knew, from the stacks of unopened mail I often discreetly filed away for her, that she had been letting both slide for years. The company had paid them on her behalf to protect their investment, the amounts ballooning the total debt, and now their patience had run out. They were calling in the full note. The amount due, a staggering sum that included the original loan, years of interest, and penalty fees, was to be paid in 30 days. If not, their house, would be sold at a public foreclosure auction. "Mama," Walter said, his voice cracking with disbelief. "A reverse mortgage? Why didn't you tell me?" "I didn't want to be a burden," she whispered, sinking into a kitchen chair, the letter now lying on the table between us like a death sentence. "The man said it was a good idea, that it was my money. I didn't know. I didn't understand." For the first time in my life, I saw my formidable mother-in-law completely and utterly broken. Her pride, her sharp-tongued authority, the very things that had made my life so difficult, all crumbled away, leaving behind a terrified, grieving old woman. This house wasn't just a financial asset to her. It was her entire identity. It was the home her husband had been born in, the place she had raised her own son, the living, breathing museum of her entire life. "This is all I have left of your father, Walter," she sobbed, her face buried in her hands. "They can't take it. I cannot lose this house. I would rather die." Walter and I spent the rest of the day and a long, sleepless night in a frantic, hopeless search for a solution. We spread our own financial documents across the dining room table, the picture of our own modest, carefully managed life. Walter's salary from the city was steady, but it wasn't large. My secret income, while substantial, was not yet the fortress it would later become. We looked at our savings, our retirement accounts. We had enough to live comfortably, but not enough to pay off a six-figure debt in 30 days. We called our bank. We called a mortgage broker. The answer was the same everywhere. Without the income to support a loan of that size with no real collateral besides our own small home, it was impossible. The auction date was set. The house was going to be lost. And as I sat there, in the dead of night, watching my husband's silent despair and listening to the sound of my mother-in-law weeping in her bedroom, the gears in my own mind began to turn. There was a way. A risky, complicated, and secret way. But it was the only way I could see to save them from themselves. The night after we received the foreclosure notice was the longest of my life. The house was shrouded in a heavy, suffocating silence, the kind that follows a death in the family. In a way, it was a death. The spirit of the home, the proud, unshakable sense of permanence that had been its defining feature, had been extinguished. Walter, exhausted by a grief so profound it had no words, had fallen into a fitful sleep beside me. From her room down the hall, I could hear the faint, heartbreaking sound of Mama Rose weeping, a sound I had not heard since the day her husband passed away. I, however, could not sleep. I slipped out of bed and made my way to my corner of the living room, to the soft glow of my laptop screen. On one side of my monitor, I had our family's bleak financial reality displayed in a spreadsheet: Walter's modest salary, our meager savings, the mountain of their debt. On the other side, I had the live portal to my own investment portfolio, a vibrant, dynamic world of stocks, bonds, and mutual funds, a secret landscape of financial security that I had cultivated in the dark for years. The contrast was a dizzying, painful illustration of the two lives I was living. I was a quiet pauper in their world and a silent queen in my own. The decision I faced was monumental. To save their house would require me to liquidate a substantial portion of the retirement fund I had so carefully built, a fund that was meant to secure my own future, a future that felt increasingly uncertain. It was a massive financial risk. And for what? For a mother-in-law who treated me with daily contempt? For a family that saw me as a decorative but useless appendage? For a moment, a cold, pragmatic voice in my head, the voice of the financial consultant, told me to do nothing. It was their debt, their mistake. It was not my responsibility to save them from themselves. But then I looked around the dark, quiet room at the shadows of the furniture that had been in this family for generations. I thought of Walter, of the deep, abiding love he had for this place, for the memories of his father that lived in these walls. I thought of the heritage, of the stories of struggle and triumph that had soaked into the very floorboards. And I realized my motivation was not about saving Mama Rose from her own pride. It was about saving this house for Walter, for the memory of his father, and for the future generations who deserved to know this history. I was not just saving a building. I was preserving a legacy. And that, I decided in the quiet stillness of that desperate night, was a sounder investment than any stock or bond. The next morning, I began to move. I operated with the quiet, methodical precision of a secret agent. My first call was to a lawyer I knew through my consulting work, a sharp, discreet woman named Carol who specialized in real estate law and, more importantly, in complex, confidential transactions. I explained the situation and she understood immediately. "You can't buy it in your own name, Angela," she advised. "The humiliation would be too much for them, and it would change the family dynamic in a way you can't predict. We need to create a shield." The Shield was a limited liability company, a shell corporation designed for the sole purpose of anonymity. Carol handled the paperwork, and within a week, Savannah Heritage Properties, LLC, was born. The name was deliberately bland, respectable, and untraceable back to me. While she handled the legal architecture, I began the painful process of dismantling a portion of my financial fortress. I sold off a block of high-performing tech stocks. I pulled funds from a mutual fund I had been carefully nurturing for a decade. Watching the balances in my accounts shrink was a terrifying experience, but I held fast to my purpose. The day of the foreclosure auction was one of the most stressful of my life. I couldn't go myself. My presence would be too risky. Carol went in my stead, armed with the capital from my liquidated assets. I spent the day at home, a bundle of raw nerves, trying to act normal. I baked a lemon pound cake, the irony not lost on me. I listened as Mama Rose spoke with a grim, fatalistic acceptance about having to move into a small apartment. Walter was silent, his face gray with grief. Every ring of the phone made my heart leap into my throat. Finally, at 3 p.m, my phone vibrated with a text from Carol. It was 3 simple words. "The house is yours." A wave of relief, so profound it almost buckled my knees, washed over me. I had done it. I had pulled my family back from the brink. I went to the pantry to hide my face, and I wept with a mixture of relief, terror, and the strange, lonely burden of my secret. A few days later, the miracle arrived. The family's lawyer called Walter with the news. His voice was filled with a tone of stunned disbelief. An anonymous benefactor, a local LLC called Savannah Heritage Properties, had purchased the house at auction. The new owner, the lawyer explained, had no intention of evicting them. In fact, they were willing to draft a lifetime lease agreement, allowing them to stay in the home for a symbolic monthly rent of $300, just enough to cover the annual property taxes. The joy that erupted in the house was a physical force. Mama Rose wept, but this time her tears were of pure, unadulterated gratitude. She spoke of angels, of the profound kindness of strangers, of God's mysterious and wonderful ways. Walter hugged me, lifting me off the ground, his face alight with a relief so profound it made him look 10 years younger. And I had to stand there in the center of their celebration and pretend to be just as surprised, just as mystified as they were. I was the author of their miracle, the secret angel who had answered their prayers, and all they could see was the useless parasite, the woman who cooked bland casseroles and contributed nothing. And so, for 6 months, I lived a dual life, a quiet performance in a theater of my own making. By day, I was Angela, the unemployed, slightly pathetic daughter-in-law, the target of Mama Rose's constant low-grade stream of criticism and sighs of disappointment. I would listen with a practiced, serene patience as she lamented my lack of contribution, my failure to pull my weight in the family she so fiercely protected. I would nod, and I would smile, and I would continue to cook the meals and tend the garden. By night, after the house had settled into a quiet rhythm of sleep, I was Angela Hayes, the successful financial consultant, a woman whose advice was sought, valued, and handsomely compensated. In the silent darkness of the living room, I would manage my growing client list, my assets, and, most ironically, the finances of the very house in which I was deemed a freeloader. The symbolic $300 rent check Mama Rose would grudgingly write out to Savannah Heritage Properties. Each month would be deposited by me via a mobile app into an account I had created specifically to pay the home's substantial property taxes. I was a ghost in my own financial machine, a secret benefactor hiding in plain sight. For a time, the miracle of the anonymous benefactor had softened my mother-in-law. Her relief at not losing her home was so profound that it manifested as a temporary ceasefire in her war against me. But as the months wore on and the crisis faded from memory, the familiar patterns of her resentment began to reemerge. The anonymous kindness of the LLC was an abstract concept. My perceived uselessness was a concrete daily irritation she could latch onto. Her gratitude towards her unseen savior did not extend to the woman who was actually washing her dishes. The final confrontation, the moment the curtain was finally torn away from my long-running play, happened on a humid Thursday evening. The air was thick and heavy, and the mood at the dinner table was equally oppressive. The catalyst, as it often was a piece of news from the outside world that Mama Rose managed to twist into a personal indictment of me. "I ran into Betty Jean from church today," she announced, her voice carrying a tone of grave importance. "Her daughter-in-law, the one who works at the bank, just got a big promotion. Vice president. They bought Betty Jean a brand new car for her birthday. A Cadillac." She paused, letting the information land, her eyes fixed on me. "Isn't that wonderful? A daughter-in-law who actually contributes to the family, who shows her appreciation." Walter, sensing the impending storm, tried to steer the conversation away. "That's great for them, Mama. How's your casserole, Angela? It's delicious." But Mama Rose would not be deterred. "It's bland," she declared, pushing her fork into the potatoes on her plate. "I suppose you had a busy day doing, well, whatever it is you do all day, Angela. Reading your books, tidying up. It must be a very taxing life." "Mama, please," Walter sighed, his voice heavy with a weariness that was all too familiar. "Not tonight." "Don't you, Mama, please me, Walter," she snapped, her voice rising. "I am not the one who should be ashamed. I am talking about the fact that you work yourself to the bone day in and day out at a thankless city job while she sits here in this house your father built doing nothing. It is not right." I sat in silence, my hands clasped in my lap, a portrait of infuriating calm. I had weathered this storm 1,000 times, but tonight something was different. My patience, the virtue I had cultivated for decades, the thing I had mistaken for strength, suddenly felt like a form of self-betrayal. My silence was not keeping the peace. It was enabling her abuse. As she continued her tirade, a long, rambling list of my perceived failures, my gaze drifted around the dining room. I looked at the beautiful antique sideboard against the wall, which I had secretly paid to have refinished. I looked at the gleaming chandelier overhead, whose substantial electricity bill I paid every month from my own account. I looked at the very roof over our heads, a roof that was still in this family's possession only because of the money from my night job. The sheer, staggering hypocrisy of the situation washed over me. I had been willing to endure the insults for Walter's sake, for the sake of a fragile family peace. I had been willing to be their secret savior, to ask for nothing in return. But to be that savior and to still be subjected to this venomous, ungrateful abuse in the very home I had saved, it was too much. The quiet accountant in my soul, The woman who demanded that the books be balanced could no longer tolerate this profound and gaping deficit of decency. Her voice reached a crescendo, her face flushed with a righteous fury. "I don't know what my son ever saw in you," she shouted, her hands slamming the table for emphasis, making the water glasses jump. "You are a leech, clinging to him, clinging to this family. You are a parasite." The word, the one she had used so many times before, hung in the air, but this time it landed differently. It did not wound me. It did not shame me. It clarified everything. I calmly placed my fork and knife together on my plate. The small, quiet click of silver against china was the only sound in the suddenly silent room. Walter was staring at me. Mama Rose was watching me, expecting tears or a retreat into silence. They did not know that a fundamental shift had just occurred. A line had been crossed, and I was about to walk back over it, holding the truth in my hands like a lantern in the dark. In the ringing silence that followed Mama Rose's final venomous insult, I did something I had never done before. I did not shrink. I did not look to my husband for defense. I did not retreat into the quiet, wounded space she had created for me. Instead, I met her furious gaze with an expression of profound and weary calm. I calmly placed my fork and knife together on my plate, the soft, deliberate clink of silver against china echoing in the tense air like the cocking of a pistol. Walter's head snapped up, his eyes wide, recognizing this small, uncharacteristic gesture as the profound shift it was. Mama Rose's tirade faltered, her self-righteous certainty momentarily punctured by my unexpected lack of reaction. Slowly, deliberately, I pushed my chair back and stood up. My movements were unhurried, imbued with a gravity that held their attention captive. I walked across the old heart pine floor, my footsteps the only sound in the room, to the antique oak filing cabinet that stood in the corner. It was a piece of furniture that had been in this house for 50 years, a silent witness to generations of family dinners, arguments, and celebrations. I pulled open the bottom drawer, the old metal runners groaning in protest. From the very back, behind years of household warranties and old tax returns, I retrieved a thick, heavy manila folder. I walked back to the dining table and placed the folder in the center, next to the half-eaten remains of the bland casserole. The soft, definitive thud of the folder hitting the polished wood seemed to suck all the remaining air out of the room. I sat back down in my chair and looked at my mother-in-law. "Mama Rose," I began, my voice quiet but carrying an immense newfound weight. "For 5 years you have operated under a certain set of assumptions. You have assumed that I am jobless. You have assumed that I am a financial drain on this family. You have assumed that I am a parasite. I have allowed you to believe these things, partly to keep the peace and partly because the truth was complicated." I paused, letting my words sink in. I then gestured to the house around us, to the very walls that had absorbed her decades of pride and my years of quiet suffering. "You remember 6 months ago, don't you? The foreclosure notice, the absolute certainty that you were going to lose this house, the home your husband was born in?" She looked confused, wary, unsure of where this was leading. She gave a small hesitant nod. "You remember how you wept," I continued, my voice still gentle. "And you remember the miracle, the anonymous kind benefactor who swept in at the last minute and bought the house at the auction, saving your legacy?" "Of course I remember," she said, a flicker of her old fire returning. "A good, decent person. Not everyone is as selfish as you, Angela." That benefactor, I said, my voice as clear and steady as a bell, that anonymous LLC that bought this house, that was me, Mama Rose. I bought the house. The silence that followed was so absolute, so profound, it was like a physical presence. It was the sound of a world breaking. I heard a sharp clatter as Walter, my dear shocked husband, dropped his fork onto his plate. I watched as the fiery, righteous color drained from Mama Rose's face, leaving behind a waxy, pale white mask of utter, uncomprehending shock. "How?" she finally whispered, the single word a tiny cracked sound in the immense silence. "With the inheritance my grandmother left me, which I never told you about," I explained, my voice still even, still calm. I was a consultant presenting a report, laying out the facts. "And with the income from my night job, the one you never knew I had. For the past 4 years, after you both go to sleep, I have been working. I am a freelance financial consultant, a very successful one." It was then that I reached for the folder, I opened it and turned it around for them to see. I was no longer asking them to believe me. I was showing them the irrefutable proof. I laid the documents out one by one, a quiet, devastating paper trail of my secret life. "This," I said, pointing to the first page, "is the official deed to this property registered to Savannah Heritage Properties, LLC. And this," I added, sliding another paper forward, "is the official formation document for that LLC, listing me, Angela Hayes, as the sole proprietor." I didn't stop there. I showed them my business license. I showed them my tax returns from the past 4 years, the declared income on them, a number so large it was clearly beyond their comprehension. I showed them the bank statements, the clear 6-figure transfers from my investment accounts to the escrow company to fund the purchase of the house. And then I delivered the final, most intimate blow. "And the $300 rent check you write out to the LLC each month," I said, pulling out the copies of her endorsed checks. "You're not paying it to some kind stranger, Mama Rose. You're paying it to me, and it just barely covers the annual property taxes on this house, which I've also been paying on your behalf." I sat back, my case presented. Mama Rose stared at the mountain of evidence on her dining room table. She looked at the deed to the house she thought was hers. She looked at the undeniable proof of my success. She looked at her own signature on the back of a check made out to the woman she had just called a parasite. The entire foundation of her reality, the worldview in which she was the proud, struggling matriarch and I was the useless freeloader, had just been systematically and completely demolished. She sank back into her chair, her body seeming to shrink. The formidable, iron-willed woman I had known my entire adult life vanishing before my very eyes. "So, this whole time," she whispered, more to herself than to me, her voice filled with the dawning catastrophic horror. "This whole time, I've been living in my daughter-in-law's house and calling her a parasite." The silence that descended on the dining room was a physical entity, a thick, heavy blanket that smothered all sound, all breath. It was a silence filled with the deafening noise of a lifetime of assumptions being utterly and completely shattered. Walter sat frozen, his fork still held loosely in his hand, his gaze flickering between the damning pile of documents on the table and my face, as if he were trying to reconcile the quiet, long-suffering wife he thought he knew with the powerful, secretive stranger who had just been revealed. Mama Rose was a statue carved from shock, her face a pale, bloodless mask, her eyes fixed on the deed to the house, as if it were a serpent about to strike. Walter was the first to break. He let the fork clatter onto his plate, the sharp sound making both of us jump. He looked at me, and in his eyes, I saw not just shock, but a deep, profound, and heart-wrenching guilt. "Angie," he whispered, his voice hoarse, with an emotion I couldn't quite name. "All these years, you've been carrying this? Carrying us? Why didn't you tell me?" His shame was not just about the money, it was about his own passivity, his own failure. I stood by and I let her treat you like that, all while you were. He couldn't finish the sentence. He just shook his head, the weight of his own inaction finally crashing down upon him. It was his voice, his pain, that finally broke the spell that held Mama Rose captive. A single choked sob escaped her lips, and then another. The iron-willed matriarch, the formidable woman whose sharp tongue had been the scourge of my existence, completely and utterly crumbled. The pride that had been her armor for 78 years dissolved, and she began to weep with a raw, racking grief that was terrifying to behold. They were not the crocodile tears of manipulation I had seen so many times before. This was the sound of a soul breaking. She wept for her own cruelty, for her blindness, for the sheer, monumental hypocrisy of her position, which she was only now, in this terrible moment, beginning to comprehend. "Angela!" she choked out between sobs, her words fractured and almost incoherent. "Child, forgive me. Can you ever forgive me?" This was the moment I had unknowingly been preparing for, the moment where I could have taken my revenge. I could have listed every insult, every slight, every moment of humiliation she had put me through for the past 30 years. I could have demanded a full and detailed apology. I could have wielded my newfound power like a weapon, just as she had always wielded hers. But as I looked at her, this broken, weeping old woman, I felt no triumph. The anger had vanished, leaving behind only a vast and weary sense of pity. What good would revenge do? It would only perpetuate the cycle of pain. I stood up, walked around the table, and gently placed a hand on her trembling shoulder. "There is nothing to forgive, Mama Rose," I said softly, my voice a gentle balm in the raw emotional air. She looked up at me, her face a mess of tears and confusion. "But I called you a parasite," I finished for her, my voice still soft. "I know, and in a way, you were right." Walter looked at me, his expression baffled, but I kept my gaze fixed on my mother-in-law. "I do feed on this family," I continued, my words weaving a new definition for her old insult. "I feed on the joy it brings me to see Walter come home to the house his father built, a place he thought he had lost forever. I feed on the deep, quiet satisfaction of knowing that you, the matriarch of this family, can sleep soundly under a roof that is safe and secure. I feed on the peace of mind that comes from knowing that this legacy, this history, this home is protected. That is the only payment I have ever wanted. The happiness of this family is the resource I have been drawing from. So you see, in a way, I have been a parasite. I just wanted to preserve the thing I was feeding on." My strange, gentle confession was more disarming than any accusation could have been. It was a lifeline of grace, an offer not of absolution, but of a shared, redefined understanding of what our family could be. It allowed her to see my actions not as a power play that had humiliated her, but as an act of profound, selfless, and secret love that had saved her. We sat at that table for a long time. The damning documents still spread out between us, but their power had changed. They were no longer evidence in a prosecution, but the blueprints for our family's reconstruction. We talked. For the first time, we truly talked. Walter, his eyes filled with a new and shining respect, asked me 100 questions about my work, about my clients, about the secret life I had led while he was asleep. And Mama Rose, humbled and quiet, simply listened. Her occasional tearful interjection of, "I just can't believe it," a mantra of her shattered worldview. She was seeing me, really seeing me, for the very first time. Later, after the plates had been cleared and a fragile, tentative peace had settled over the house, she looked at me, her eyes red-rimmed but clear with a new understanding. "All this time," she said, her voice a marvel of quiet awe, "all this time you had this power, this strength, and you kept it silent?" "It was never about power, Mama," I replied, my voice full of a truth I now fully understood myself. "It was about family. We all feed each other. It's a symbiotic relationship, not a parasitic one. You and Walter, you give us our history, our roots, a connection to our legacy. I, in my own quiet way, provide the stability that allows those roots to remain planted in solid ground. It's a fair exchange." The week that followed the great revelation was a study in quiet, awkward grace. The house, which had for so long been a stage for our tense, predictable drama, became a space of profound and uncharted silence. But it was not the cold, angry silence of before. It was a careful, tentative silence, the kind that follows a massive storm where everyone is afraid to move too quickly for fear of dislodging the fragile new peace. Mama Rose, for the first time in my memory, was quiet. She would watch me, her expression a mixture of awe, shame, and a deep, churning curiosity. She saw me take work calls in the living room now, my voice shifting from the gentle, familial tones she knew to the crisp, confident language of a financial professional, and the look on her face was one of someone trying to understand a foreign language she had never known existed. Walter, my dear husband, was a changed man. He treated me with a new kind of tender, reverent attention, as if he were seeing me for the first time. He would bring me coffee while I worked late. His simple, loving gesture, a silent, ongoing apology for the years he had failed to see my struggle. The fragile truce, this new, unspoken dynamic, could not last forever. I knew that for our family to truly heal, we had to build something new in the space where the old resentments had been. I just didn't know what it would be. The answer, when it came from the most unexpected of places. Mama Rose herself. A week to the day after the confrontation, I was in the kitchen preparing an early dinner. Mama Rose walked in, not with her usual air of critical supervision, but with a hesitant, humble uncertainty. She stood there for a moment, twisting her apron in her hands, a woman who had never been at a loss for words, now searching for the right ones. "Angela," she began, her voice soft, devoid of its usual iron authority. "I've been doing a lot of thinking this week." I turned from the stove to give her my full attention. "Yes, Mama." "I can't just sit here," she said, the words coming out in a rush. "I can't live in this house, in your house, and not contribute. It's not right. All my life, I've taken pride in pulling my own weight. I'm not a parasite, Angela." She said the word without flinching, a clear and painful acknowledgement of her own past cruelty. "I may be old, but I am not useless. I need you to give me a job." The request was so stunning, so revolutionary in its complete reversal of our lifelong roles, that for a moment I was speechless. She was not just asking for a task to fill her days. She was acknowledging my power, my competence, and she was asking, with a humility that was more profound than any tearful apology, to be a part of my world. A wave of deep, Genuine affection for this difficult, proud woman washed over me. I saw in her request not an act of submission, but an act of immense, courageous pride. A brilliant, beautiful idea began to form in my mind. A way to not just give her a job, but to restore her dignity in a way that would honor her and heal us. I smiled, a real warm smile. "A job, Mama Rose?" I said. "I think I have a much better idea." I walked to the pantry and pulled out the old worn recipe book that had been her mother's, its pages soft as cloth and stained with the ghosts of 1,000 family meals. I placed it on the kitchen table. "Your Sunday dinners are legendary," I said, my voice full of a sincerity she could not doubt. "People in this neighborhood talk about your fried chicken and your peach cobbler like they are works of art. That skill, that knowledge you have in this kitchen, that is not a hobby, Mama. That is a professional grade talent." I saw a flicker of the old pride return to her eyes. "What if," I continued, leaning forward, my voice full of an excitement that was infectious, "we were to start a small, high-end catering business right here from this kitchen? We could call it Savannah Seasons or Rose's Table, a taste of authentic Southern home cooking for people who have forgotten what real food tastes like. You wouldn't be my employee. You would be the head chef, the heart and soul of the entire operation. Your recipes, your standards, your name. And I said, tapping my laptop on the counter, would handle the business side. The finances, the marketing, the client relations. I'll build the website. I'll manage the books. I'll bring in the customers. You just have to do what you do better than anyone else in the world. Cook." I finished, my proposal hanging in the air between us. It was not an act of charity. It was a sound business proposition that honored her unique and powerful contribution. She stared at me, her eyes wide, and for the first time in years, I saw a genuine, brilliant light ignite within them. It was the light of purpose, of passion, of a future she had not allowed herself to imagine. "Partners?" she whispered, the word feeling new and strange on her tongue. "Partners," I confirmed with a nod. And that is how our new life began. We are no longer just a family living under one roof, navigating the treacherous waters of old wounds and unspoken resentments. We are a team. Our days are now filled with the cheerful chaos of a new enterprise, with the smells of baking and the sounds of laughter. Walter has become our official taste tester and delivery driver, a role he cherishes. Mama Rose, my formidable, indomitable mother-in-law, has been reborn. She is no longer a queen ruling over a silent kingdom, but a creative force, a celebrated chef, a woman whose contribution is the very foundation of our shared success. We are all feeding each other, not with criticism and resentment, but with love, mutual respect, and the best damn peach cobbler in the state of Georgia. And for the first time in my life, our family feels less like a quiet, obligatory meal and more like a true and magnificent feast.